Yeah, the use of the health metaphor by ruling elites, right? Calling things a virus, calling things that are politically dangerous viruses. In the
Yeah.
Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin called rock and roll a virus because it was taking down, the youth of the Soviet Union who were more interested in Elvis Presley than in Joe Stalin. So, I mean, it's common, and this is something that postmodern thinkers have noticed, right? Because they're interested in language, as are you, and so they notice the way that language and words are deployed against political threats. And that's one way you do it, right? You talk about Trump as a virus. Well, you can almost feel that because you kind of know what it means to be sick. Everyone's had the flu, right? And then you have a virus that's killing people, and it's sort of like Trump, who was killing the body politic of America.
Yeah.
But and that's one thing I noticed. And then the second thing is, I do believe we are in a new phase, I think what's happening now, and I don't know exactly why it's happening now, but we are living in an age of hysteria, unlike any we've seen before. Now, America is famous for its hysterias, all the way back to Salem and through the Red Scare in the 1950s. But if you start with like 2011, from the last 10 years, it was the sexual assault on campuses, date rape, every woman's being raped on campuses. Then it was a couple of years later, then it was systemic racism and cops are killing black people on the street wantonly. And then it was the Trump phenomenon, and we're going to be putting gays and immigrants and Muslims in concentration camps. And then it was Russia hysteria. Russia's controlling our country. Putin is the boss now. and now it's COVID. It's sort of like we're in this phase of sort of like serial hysteria.
Yeah.
Like Americans, I don't know if this is part of American culture, or do you have any thoughts about that? Does that make any sense to you? It seems sort of new to me.
I mean, part of me wants to go back to 9/11 as kind of what created the mood, and then the mood continued, but then it kept grasping for new things to feed it. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, because I often think about, and I do think, and again, I would say I kind of evolved on the COVID stuff. Like I didn't necessarily see the response to it as dangerous as I do now. But part of my evolution was beginning to recognize the kind of war on terror, the echoes of the war on terror. And particularly the way that, this idea that, and I think this, in all of these kinds of panics, there's a kind of elements of this, right? But if you think back to Dick Cheney's like idea that the whole idea of like the 1%, if there's like a 1% chance of a terrorist attack on American soil, it has to be treated as 100% chance, right? And so that kind of skewing of risk assessment, which then becomes the legitimating argument for, basically whatever elites decide, whatever sort of heavy-handed approach elites decide is necessary, and sort of propagandize the population into accepting. I mean, this was really part of where I started to see the danger, was that I saw the echo. I was young and was kind of formed by like observing and reacting to what happened after 9/11 and with the war on terror. I mean, I was in New York at 9/11, and, I found I was definitely a more conventional lefty in some ways at that point. But this is one way that I haven't really evolved. Like I found that I found the response to it horrifying. I continue to find it horrifying. So I see my response to like what's going on now as consistent with that, right? Because they both involve this kind of this power grab that was legitimated by this propagandistic risk inflation, which could then become the alibi on the basis of quote unquote saving lives or protecting life or something like that, could then become the alibi for basically anything. Right. And so, but going back to your other question, I would say that, it's hard for me not to just feel that like there was an emotional pivot that occurred with 9/11, and that set off this kind of hysteria that we've never really recovered from, right? There's the Joan Didion essay, Fixed Ideas. I haven't read it for a while, but I thought it was one of the good essays that kind of captured that that mood shift that 9/11 brought about.
Okay.
And, I think it's almost like there's been and I mean, this goes to one other point, which I've kind of insisted on, which is that I find when people talk about how like new media changes things, like they overemphasize how the whole misinformation panic was premised on the idea that it could kind of plant new ideas in people's heads, right? And make them think something bad, right? But what I think is usually underemphasized is the way it shifts how we feel and how we what our kind of emotional baselines are, and how we apprehend and respond to whatever the information is that we're being presented with. And so, I think about with 9/11, like you started having that, what was that sort of ticker tape thing on the bottom of the TV screen, right? Which is where you started, I remember just watching news in that period, you started to see that kind of bombardment with like constant updates and, and I think that's a sort of visualization of the kind of, the way that, the events as refracted through media then create this kind of, or help foment and sustain this kind of mood of hysteria. And so, I don't know. I mean, I definitely think of it as a mood that's been, that was decisively established. And then, there are all sorts of political incentives as well as, economic incentives for the media itself in kind of sustaining and stoking this mood, right? And so one way of thinking about it is, and this is just I haven't given this that much thought, but that, there is a kind of grasping around for new narratives that can be used to sustain this.
And the ultimate objective is control, right? Social control by the elites always? Is that always what they're after?
I mean, I tend to,
right?
I mean, in one sense, yes, but I also tend to want to emphasize their relative incompetence in a sense. That,
for sure. Yeah.
That there's a, and to kind of more focus on like what the emergent system is that's kind of instantiated in these developments. But, that I think there's, and here, I mean, the 9/11 comparison is interesting, right? Because I do think, it's pretty clear that with Cheney, Rumsfeld, people like that, you had and weirdly it became like anti-Semitic to, even though Cheney and Rumsfeld were not Jewish, whatever, but like weirdly it became anti-Semitic to even say this, right? But like you clearly had this like cadre of people who had been, going through the revolving door of the sort of national security apparatus for decades, and who had very particular ideas about what they wanted to do in the Middle East, right? And that they, saw this as an opportunity and seized on it. Like that doesn't seem that that difficult to support as a claim. I mean, I'm not as convinced in the case of COVID that there's as much of a clear agency at work. I mean, I think, when I see what the CDC was like doing and saying this week, I mean, they honestly just come across as like fumbling idiots.
Yeah.
I mean, they really are just like clownishly incompetent, except at, sustaining the idea that we have to listen to them and that they're, completely inept. And I mean, so I don't necessarily see it as quite as grand of a plan, except insofar as it's a bureaucracy that, has carved out a particular role for itself. And so it sustains that status by continuing to kind of, maintain this sort of farcical and idiotic idea that its assessments and recommendations actually have any value.
But they do.
But which it does by stoking continuing to stoke hysteria and getting the media to aid it in that.
So stoking fear actually helps with their legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
They become the savior. They become the savior in that case, right? They become the father figure who's going to save us from the bad person or the bad disease.
Yeah, and having a state of emergency, a sort of constant state of emergency, implicitly just makes the case that these kind of unaccountable agencies that are completely unaccountable for anything that they've done, like that there's literally no way to hold them to account. They're the same, basically roughly the same people under Biden as they were under Trump. There's literally no way to hold them to account for their obvious ineptitude in all of this. But that's kind of the point, right? Because as long as you maintain this idea that there's this clear and present danger, then, well, you can't allow people to decide whether they think this bureaucracy is actually effective at what it claims to do, because that would allow these lunatic anti-vaxxers to have a say or whatever.
Yep.